Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Clark from the Center for Weight Loss Success. Today on Losing Weight USA, we're going to talk about metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is a very common diagnosis. It takes up about 5 different potential checkbox type things. And if you have 3 of 5, you've got metabolic syndrome. So we'll talk about what that actually means, as well as what to do about it. And one of the nice things with this is that with metabolic syndrome, we now actually have some medicine treatments as opposed to, gee, it's just lifestyle changes. Lifestyle changes are very important, but actually the medical treatments, injections can work very nicely as well. All right, welcome to Losing Weight USA, real-time answers to your weight loss questions, some of the latest updates and research, as well as a little bit of expert advice. Gives you direct access not only to me, but you should be receiving the health tips and recipes via the membership portal, and I encourage you, get into the membership site. We keep adding more things in there. It's a way to get access to all our educational materials. Each of these webinars is going to last about 30 minutes or so. If you have questions, type them into the chat box as we go along. We'll get to them at the end. If you think of things once we're all done, just give us a yell here at the Center for Weight Loss Success. The email is success@cfwls.com. Phone number 757-873-1880. All right, let's dive into this. So metabolic syndrome, that's what we're talking about. Metabolic syndrome actually very, very common, very common. It's going to affect at least 1/3 of adults throughout their lifetime, probably closer to 1/2 of all adults. But metabolic syndrome already affects over 64 million people in the United States. And metabolic syndrome describes a collection of metabolic abnormalities. You put them together, you got metabolic syndrome. And these metabolic abnormalities are what tend to lead to both type 2 diabetes as well as a much higher risk of cardiac disease. And so, yeah, it'd be nice to figure these things out, address them ahead of time to avoid getting type 2 diabetes or cardiac disease. So that's what we're really kind of looking at there. So what is metabolic syndrome? Metabolic syndrome, just a little history, it's a relatively recent diagnosis, meaning that no one had actually put together these things until relatively recently. When I say relatively recently, we're talking about 1988. Okay, and it was first described in 1988 by a Dr. Gerald Raven. What he noted is that people with insulin resistance showed common metabolic disturbances or abnormalities, and these abnormalities increased their risk for cardiac disease. It was originally called Syndrome X, later kind of insulin resistance syndrome, and finally it's been kind of labeled as metabolic syndrome. But basically, I think the insulin resistance syndrome was probably a better descriptor because each of the abnormalities has to do with insulin resistance. But basically what this is then used for is that it's used as a diagnostic tool to identify people that have high cardiovascular disease risk. And so you put these things together, this person, this individual, this group of people are going to have a much higher risk of cardiovascular disease. And what he noted, and he noted this back in the early 80s, is that Dr. Raven noted that the low-fat diet basically makes all the problems that make up metabolic syndrome, it makes them worse. Okay. All right, so what is metabolic syndrome? So if we define it, metabolic syndrome is you have metabolic syndrome if you have at least 3 of these 5 things. And only one of them has to do with weight, and that's the first one. And they don't really weigh you. What it does is it looks at waist circumference. Anyone that has a waist circumference more than 40 inches for men or 35 inches for women, so greater than 40 inches for men, greater than 35 inches for women, is kind of checks that first box. And that's kind of how they look at weight. So literally, you don't have to be that much overweight if you carry your weight in the belly area. Okay, you could easily not really be that much overweight. And people say, oh, you're not very overweight, but you could have this already. All right, next one is fasting triglycerides greater than 150. And this is actually very, very common. So it has to do with your cholesterol panel. Okay. And then the other thing that has to do with cholesterol panel is the HDL. So fasting triglycerides over 150 or HDL less than 40 for men or less than 50 for women. Again, something that's fairly relatively common. Those are the first three: waist circumference, look at fasting triglycerides, as well as their HDL. The fourth thing is looking at blood pressure. So either your blood pressure is greater than 135 over 85, or you actually use a blood pressure medication. And again, another very common problem. Okay. And none of these are really, gee, these are really bad. It's like, no, they're just kind of barely abnormal. Okay. And then finally, the fifth one is a fasting glucose greater than 100. Okay. Also very common. Okay. So again, we're looking at 3 out of 5 of those things: waist circumference, more than 40 for men, more than 35 for women; fasting triglycerides greater than 150; an HDL that is less than 40 for men or less than 50 for women; blood pressure, either being on a medication or having a blood pressure greater than 135 over 85; and then finally, fasting glucose greater than 100. So 3 out of 5 of those things, you have metabolic syndrome. And basically, again, going back to the first slide, is metabolic syndrome basically equals insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is getting incredibly common. I say this over and over, but insulin resistance is basically a state that your body requires more insulin than normal to keep blood sugars normal. Okay? So you may get your blood sugar checked at your doctor's office, or you may check it yourself. Say, gee, my blood sugar is fairly decent. It's less than 100. Okay. And typically we don't call someone diabetic till it's over 125. Okay. But so, okay, my blood sugar is less than 100. What if it takes a whole lot of insulin to keep that blood sugar at less than 100? You have insulin resistance. Okay. Now, it's also been known, I mentioned this earlier, that a low-fat diet actually makes all of these little, problems: blood pressure, glucose, triglycerides, circumference of the abdominal circumference. Then, low-fat diet makes all these things worse. And this obviously also implies that a low-carb diet may actually improve these metabolic derangements. And the bottom line is that a low-carb diet will improve these metabolic derangements. Now, low-carb diets basically are going to allow insulin levels to come down. And so a low-carb diet is what's going to improve each of these 5 different metabolic derangements. Okay? Now, I mentioned earlier, too, is that one of the newer things that's out there, as we've talked about kind of some of these injectable weight loss medications that were developed for diabetes, but they actually do treat insulin resistance. And these are the first medications that actually do treat insulin resistance well. And so they'll actually, we found with small studies now, using these injectable medications, is that people can actually decrease their cardiac risk significantly with use of these medications. They also tend to lose weight, which is also very helpful, but it tends to improve these metabolic parameters I just laid out in multiple different ways. And so, yes, the low-carb diet is going to do that, but also some of these newer injectable medications as well will do this. All right, so back to the low carb diets. We're not getting too much into the injectable medication, but basically realize that both the medications that are available, semaglutide as well as tirzepatide, will both treat insulin resistance. Okay? But low carb diet treats insulin resistance as well. So how does that actually work? In a low carb diet, how does it actually treat these 5 metabolic parameters? Okay? So low carb diet, one, is going to help improve waist size. As we've talked about multiple times, insulin tends to turn on fat storage. So if we can lower insulin levels, low carbohydrate diet will improve insulin levels. Carbohydrates themselves stimulate insulin release. Now, again, we talk about all the time that literally anything with calories will increase insulin somewhat. It's just that carbohydrate does it the most. So a low carb diet then is going to decrease the insulin released, and this actually helps then with fat mobilization. Fat mobilization basically means weight loss, and weight loss leading to a decrease in waist size. All right, so how does low carb diet improve fasting blood sugar, the 5th metabolic parameter? Okay, well, this one's the easy one. We take in less carbohydrate, every carbohydrate is broken down to sugar. Therefore, we take in less carbohydrate, our blood sugars will lower. So since carbohydrates make blood sugar increase, leading to an increase in the insulin level, low carb diet then is going to lower your fasting blood sugar. All right, how about the triglyceride side of the whole thing? And it will, low carb diet is going to improve fasting triglycerides. As a matter of fact, for anyone that has low or high triglycerides, the easiest way to lower your triglyceride level is a low carb diet. Yeah, you can do it with medications, you can do it, but actually the easiest way and most effective way of lowering triglycerides is a low carb diet. Because as I talked about in the cholesterol triglyceride discussion on the webinar for that, is that it actually kind of, you can't make a triglyceride without the glycerol molecule. Glycerol molecules come from the breakdown of sugar. And so subsequently, since all carbohydrates break down to sugar, the sugar molecule is then broken down into a glycerol molecule, and the glycerol molecules can be formed into a triglyceride. So if we take away the sugar, can't make the glycerol, you can't make the triglyceride. And so the easiest way, most effective way of lowering triglycerides is a low carb diet. All right, so yeah, the fatty acids that come from both the fat you eat as well as your fat you're stored, that's the fatty acid side of the triglyceride. There's 3 fatty acids in a triglyceride, that's what the tri is. And then the glyceride. The glycerol actually comes from the sugar molecule. And again, we cannot make triglyceride without the glycerol molecule. And the glycerol molecule comes from carbohydrate. All right, well, how does the HDL fit into that? Okay, but basically, when you restrict your carbohydrate intake, you automatically tend to actually increase the fat intake a little bit. And the fat intake will actually improve your HDL. I know we don't want you to go crazy on, gee, I'm just going to stuff my face with fat, making my HDL go up. But actually, it is one of the best ways to raise HDL. The other really good way to raise HDL is exercise. Exercise is one of the best ways to raise your HDL. So again, contrary to, and HDL is part of the good cholesterol. Okay, and contrary to popular belief, cholesterol is made from carbohydrate, not actually fat. Okay, it's carbohydrate that's broken down into the smaller molecules that are remade into a cholesterol molecule. And it's the insulin that stimulates the making of the cholesterol. So therefore, yes, if we can lower insulin levels, low carb diet, and subsequently some of these newer injectable medications, we're going to make less cholesterol. It's actually going to help your cholesterol as well. Blood pressure. Okay, now blood pressure, kind of how does it actually improve, a low carb diet actually improve blood pressure? Well, insulin itself causes sodium retention. Okay, it's one of the things, insulin's main job is to try to lower blood sugar. Okay, but it also causes sodium retention, which is salt. Okay, so if we're retaining salt, we then tend to retain water. We retain water, our blood pressure tends to increase. So lower insulin levels help to reverse this. Now, insulin also stimulates the release of a potent vascular constrictor, endothelial 1. So if we again decrease insulin level, then there's less of a stimulation to the release of this vascular constrictor. Vascular constrictors will actually increase blood pressure. So it's going to be less release of this endothelium 1, okay, and subsequent blood pressure drops. Okay. Insulin also inhibits the production of a vasodilator, nitric oxide. Now you hear a lot about nitric oxide if you follow fitness at all, or you follow kind of nutritional things at all. People talk about nitric oxide. Can we take supplements to improve our nitric oxide level? And nitric oxide actually is a vasodilator. And a vasodilator actually will lower blood pressure. Okay. And then finally, low carb diet, of course, decreases insulin levels. And by decreasing insulin levels, we basically reverse all those things I just talked about over the last minute and a half. Okay. All right, so in summary then, okay, controlling insulin, this metabolic syndrome is really an insulin resistance syndrome. And if we control insulin, we can control our health much better, as well as our weight. Weight is kind of included in health. So again, I really kind of go back to that age-old question, which I bring up almost every webinar, is how do you control insulin levels? One of the best ways is a low-carb diet, but also low-calorie, exercise, the more intense, the better. Quality sleep, because poor quality sleep increases cortisol levels. Cortisol makes insulin levels go up. Controlling stress, same thing with the cortisol. High stress, increased cortisol. Cortisol makes insulin levels go up. And then finally, meal timing. I think we just talked about this. Was it last week we discussed meal timing? But basically is extending the not eating periods of time. So if we extend the non-eating periods of time, that's what intermittent fasting is. Subsequently, then insulin levels do come down. And then this last one I should probably throw in, how do you improve insulin levels, is really, okay, some of these new injectable medications make insulin use much more efficient, and insulin resistance is better. And if we can improve insulin resistance, we're going to improve many different health problems. All right, very good. So I covered kind of a lot of detail in there in a fairly short period of time. So in summary then, metabolic syndrome is extremely common, probably closer to half. I kind of have greater than a third of the adult population. It's probably closer to a half, but it includes, again, these 5 different metabolic parameters. You have to have 3 of 5. Obesity, or technically waist circumference, increased triglycerides, low HDL, high blood pressure, and high blood sugar. If you've got 3 out of 5 of those, and again, none of those abnormalities are really, really significant, but you take them together and you've got a real significant problem, metabolic syndrome. And insulin resistance is really the common denominator there. And so we want to try to treat that. Again, low carb diet, exercise, all the things we talk about, but also then the newer injectable weight loss medication or diabetic medications, they actually do treat insulin resistance. All of this is going to decrease your risk of developing cardiovascular disease, as well as type 2 diabetes. And so it is something that I think is important to most people. Again, really, really common stuff. All right, very good. Question. I don't see any questions sitting out there at the moment, but if you think of things, just give us a yell here at the Center for Weight Loss Success. Stop by, get your body comp done. You can do that anytime the store is open. Log into the membership portal. You should be receiving the weight loss tips as well as weekly recipes. Tune in each Tuesday, 12:15 for the next webinar. Watch your email for the invite and link. And remember, it's your life. Make it a healthy one. Have a good day, everyone. Take care.